know that Bhante grew up in Denmark, and in 1969 he came, actually in 1968 he came to Sri Lanka, stayed at the island hermitage in Sri Lanka, which was the main place for foreign monks to stay. He stayed, I think, about 7 months, then went back to France and Denmark thinking to live as a lay person according to Dharma, but he soon realized it would be difficult to live as a lay person and to keep a good moral life. So quickly he came back to Sri Lanka and ordained as a novice monk in 1969. 2 years later, in 1971, he took his higher ordination as a bhikkhu. One thing remarkable about Bhante is the fact that since his ordination he stayed initially in the forest monastery, but then he has lived mainly alone in the forest. He started to live alone in the forest at the Bundalakuti in Hambantota province. He had a bhikkhu friend there who invited him as a novice to go to that Bundalakuti, but his friend actually was bitten by a palanga, by a very poisonous snake, and actually died. Bhante was actually living in the forest at that time, meeting up with his bhikkhu friend in the morning for the Bindabada. So when the American monk, Gnanadeepa, was bitten by the palanga at night time and actually went to the village and died there, when Bhante actually went to the kuti to meet up with the American monk to go Bindabada together, the American monk was not there. And so Bhante realized, or was informed, that his bhikkhu friend had been bitten by this very poisonous snake and had actually died during the night time. So Bhante actually inherited the Bundalakuti. Even though he was a samanera, he stayed there alone. And he stayed in this Bundalakuti for many years, maybe about 8 years altogether, living alone at the Bundalakuti. Now the Bundalakuti also had the Buddhist scriptures. So Bhante also got a very, very good knowledge of Pali and also the Buddha word in terms of the monks' rules, in terms of the discourses the Buddha gave. And he became very learned during that time, but living alone, going for long walks in the forest and also meditating as well. I first met Bhante Gnanadeepa in Thailand. I had ordained as a young monk, and we had actually heard of Bhante Gnanadeepa in Sri Lanka, and Bhante Gnanadeepa came to Thailand. He stayed for 1 year. During that time we had somewhat good contact together. After 1 year, Bhante realized that the forest life in Sri Lanka was actually not what he was looking for, that he preferred to live as a forest monk in Sri Lanka. The main thing that Bhante was looking for as a forest monk was this ability to live alone in the forest, this life of complete freedom, living according to the monks' rules, but also living according to the life as described in the verses of the elders, the arahants, and also these old Buddhist poems in the Sutta-nipata, and also the other parts of the Buddhist scriptures, which describes the life of the arahant lives, arahant monks in the Buddha's time. That appealed to him. So this was the foundation of his life, was living alone in the forest, observing the monks' rules. And living alone in the forest is actually a training, something which you gain over many years, the experience of how to live alone in the forest. So originally I met Bhante in 1978 when I was in Thailand. Later I came to Sri Lanka, and in 1990 Bhante actually visited the forest monastery where I was staying and invited me to go to this forest wilderness area called Lagala. It's at that time a very undeveloped, unpopulated area. These are old villages with the different villages interrelated. There was very little public transport. We had the actual forest walking paths where one would actually walk between villages along the forest paths. It's actually a very large wilderness area. It's actually surrounded by two mountain ranges on the west and the south. It's got this very large national wildlife park in the north, and on the east you have this very large river called the Mahaweli Ganga. So it was kind of a very secluded, isolated area, a very, very large wilderness area with these underdeveloped villages. And as I said, there were a few roads. The roads that were there were actually metal roads, and basically we walked. Normally we walked, and we had these walking paths between the villages, which before were actually maintained by the village people themselves. And also it was an area of, because you had the National Wildlife Park in the north, was also an area of much wildlife, totally undeveloped, this area. And so the life living in Lugla was one where you had quite often contact with elephants. There were leopards also present, and other forms of wildlife. Up near the national park, of course, you had other animals such as the sloth bear, which is very dangerous, of course. So Bantir, from its very first living as a samaner in Bundalakuti, living alone for about 8 years, then he actually visited several other forest wilderness areas. That's all part of his basic training. And eventually he ended up in this Lugla area where he stayed for more than 20 years. And Bante, as I mentioned, he invited me to go to Lugla in 1990. For me, that was such a wonderful thing that happened in my life as a forest monk. I had been living in forest monasteries. Forest monasteries these days are surrounded by a fence to protect the forest from outside. But Bante gave me an alternative way of life as a bhikkhu, as a forest monk, learning to live in the forest wilderness alone. So Bante had this practice of living alone in the forest, and he would explore the forest and find suitable places to stay. Often he would have a temporary kuti built, and if that kuti turned out to be suitable, that there was a permanent water supply, there was not too many mosquitoes or other biting creatures, there was no human sound, that was far enough from the village, secluded, so we would not be actually disturbed by villagers. Then if the kuti site was suitable, that temporary kuti, very basic temporary kuti, which would fall down after some months, would actually be converted into a semi-permanent kuti. But these kutis were made from mud walls. Sometimes initially they would have thatched roofs, but also the very early kutis maybe have tar sheet, but then later on would have the tiles. So these kutis, when they became semi-permanent kutis, were actually quite solid. They could last for a number of years. They were built by the local villagers. We did not want to accept support from outside. So the local villagers were very pleased to have access to monks, especially to Bhante Gnanadeepa. He was the one who had gone to this wilderness area first, established this particular way of life. And the villagers were very keen to give support to forest monks. They were the ones who built the kutis. They looked after the kutis. If no monks were present in the kutis, they maintained the kutis. And so monks could go there for this training of living alone in the forest. We had a practice of having 3 Sangha meetings every year, where the monks living in this wilderness area would come together for Patimokkha recitation on the Uposatha, and also to discuss any problems that the monks had living in the kutis or in that local wilderness area, And also the rest of the night would be involved with Dharma discussion and Vinaya discussion. So I've been talking a little bit about one special aspect of who Bhante Gnanadeepa was. He was this foreign monk who over a period of years had learned how to live alone in the forest. He always seemed to be more comfortable alone, but also gradually, living many years by himself in the forest, he developed this incredible knowledge which he could share with other monks, both local monks, Sri Lankan monks, and also other foreign monks. And he was the example, showing this way of how to live outside the forest monasteries, living this life of freedom, being alone, living very secluded in the forest itself. It's not an easy life because you have to you have to know how to live with various hardships. The kutis, the special kind of kuti that Bhante established in this wilderness area, is a kuti with 3 walls. So sometimes the front of the kuti would have a very small wall, but basically the idea of the 3 walls was the fact that you are always actually in communion with the forest environment around you. For instance, one kuti that I actually personally stayed in for, first of all, for 6 years, basically most of the wildlife in Sri Lanka I actually saw without going outside the kuti. I can see from inside the kuti the different kinds of animals and birds, reptiles, etc. I would actually see them just from inside the kuti itself. I didn't have to go to look for them. So the lifestyle is living alone in the forest, being self-independent, learning how to overcome difficulties. Things like sometimes you get drenched with rain. There's the ticks that live in the forest. You get used to the different biting creatures. Of course, if there's too many, it shows that the area is actually not suitable. But even so, sometimes you'd be covered with ticks and discomfort that causes. The area where we lived did not have so many leeches, so that was not a great problem for us. Every day was Bindabada to the local village, nearest village, which was at least half an hour's walk away. Sometimes the kutis were more than 1 hour away from the kuti, so sometimes we might even have a meeting place where the villagers could bring the food. This is the lifestyle that Bhante had developed personally, which he was able to pass on to other foreign monks and Sri Lankan monks. So Bhante gave me this alternative way of living as a forest monk to that of living in forest monasteries. Forest monasteries are very good for establishing a good meditation practice and for the basic study that one needs. But this lifestyle of living alone in the forest is one whereby the more subtle defilements which we have to overcome can be overcome. And also living alone in the forest, you're confronted with your own mind all the time. The only time you have contact with others is actually on Bindabada, which may be 20 minutes in the village or something like this, and then once again you're back alone with yourself. So this means that you really get to know who you are, and also what your mind is, what your body is, your attachments, your aversions, and basically you learn how to overcome these different defilements of the mind itself. So if one can actually find contentment, happiness, living alone in the forest, well, that's a very wonderful thing, because you're going to be content wherever you are. So I've been talking a lot about Bhante Gnanadeepa as a forest monk. I know of no other forest monks in Sri Lanka who has the same ability, same experience, same knowledge of living alone in the forest. So this is Bhante's remarkable characteristic. his way of life, which he passed on to other forest monks in Sri Lanka. This also explains why when he passed away, we had hundreds of forest monks coming to his cremation to pay respect to his body, because he showed them a different way to live the life of a forest monk today. But this is only one part of Bhante's remarkable life. There's another very important aspect. When he stayed in the Bundalakuti for this 8 years or so, he had access to all the Buddhist teachings, which were there in Pali. Some of the teachings would have been in English translations. But Bhante actually became extremely knowledgeable in Pali language. He became an expert. And also, he became an expert in the Buddha's teaching, the Vinaya Pitaka, Sutta Pitaka. He made his own notebooks, whereby he had one book about 1 inch thick, the size of an exercise book, which he had the whole Sutta Pitaka in. He had a small notebook, which was the Vinaya Pitaka. Everything was there, nothing was repeated. He had another book for his gathas, the verses. So Bhante became extremely learned, and also extremely learned in Pali, and in Pali meter, verses, to such a degree that we have these foreign professors of Pali Sanskrit who actually also make very good translations. But Bhante's knowledge of Pali was such that he could actually contribute to the knowledge of these professors in Pali. He actually, like K.R. Norman, Professor K.R. Norman, who did translations of the Tera Gatha and the Suti Nipata, Bhante actually contributed alternative suggestions, how some of these very old Pali verses and Pali words could be translated. Why is that? As part of Bhante's practice, apart from being so learned, he also he was inspired by these old teachings of the Arahants and the teachings of the early monks as expressed in the Suti Nipata, also in the Udana, verses of uplift, etc. So he used to recite these verses. So one time, when he was living alone in the forest, over a period of time, he developed a knowledge of verses whereby he would chant 3 times a day, half an hour each time of the day, once morning, once in the afternoon, once in the evening. And he had more than 2,000 verses that he would recite over a period of 3 weeks. 2,000 verses. This is the old Pali. And when you actually recite these verses over a period of months and years, maybe 10 years, 15 years, or even longer, 20 years, your knowledge of Pali becomes very deep, because you begin to understand a much deeper meaning of the Pali itself, which comes out from one's knowledge of the verses and through recitation. This is where Bhante could contribute to the modern translations which some of the Pali professors have done. So Bhante had this other side to him, was this extreme learning, but living alone in the forest, without all these books, just these basic books which he had covered out the Vinaya and Sutta Pitaka in, if he needed to, but so much was memorized. So at the Sangha meetings, for instance, when I talk about after we discussed any difficulties in the kutis, etc., then we have Dhamma discussion. We don't need to have access to books, although Bhante might have his books there. We had access to Bhante's mind and his memory. And so we could discuss Dhamma throughout the night. This is a very inspiring aspect of Bhante's personality. So I'm talking first of all about Bhante's remarkable ability to live in the forest as a forest monk, his experience, the various hardships which he had found, his spiritual strength, mental strength which he had developed, the way that he was a living example for other forest monks to follow in his footsteps. When one learns to live alone in the forest, as I said, you're confronted with your own mind. There's no escape. If you want to escape, of course, if you cannot learn to confront your own mind, to get to know your weak points and your strong points, to overcome even the nature of thought. Nature of thought is something which is constructed. So being alone in solitude, you're just faced with your mind and body. And as we know, we had the Buddha's teaching, this guidance to see things as impermanent, as unsatisfactory, and as not self. This is the test, is to put into practice the Buddha's teaching. When you're in solitude, there's no escape, to come to see your mind and body as being something which is impermanent, something which is conditioned. There's no substance, no self. It's a radical training. It's a radical training which is not suitable for many people. It's too difficult. So forest monks would come and they would try to live the forest life, which Bhante was a good example of. Some of them gained much benefit, some of them gained so much benefit, became the essence of their monk's life. Other monks could not take it and they quickly left. So this is the wonderful personality, the bhikkhu personality of Bhante Gnanadeepa. On one side, there's incredible knowledge of how to live in the forest. These 3 walled kutis, living in solitude, dependent upon the local village, completely free. If one wanted to wander, to spend some weeks away visiting another kuti area, or going on these small jarikas in the wilderness here, that you're free to. There's no restrictions. One's completely free and independent. It was really like the forest monks of Buddha's time itself. You know, the forest monks in Buddha's times were not inside a fenced wilderness. No, they were free. We can see from the early suttas how monks would go Bindabada, and then after Bindabada they would have the meal. They might come back to the monastery, have the meal, and then for the day's abiding they would go to the local forest wilderness areas. This is the monks who are actually living in monasteries. But what about the many other monks who were living outside monasteries? This wonderful, free, independent lifestyle, living according to the Vinaya, the training, the monk's rules which the Buddha laid down. But also this other quality that Bhante had, this incredible learning. So personally, having known Bhante for many, many years, having met him in different circumstances, I know of no other bhikkhu. Now I've been ordained more than 40 years, and most of my life has actually been in the forest monastery or living in the wilderness. Mainly in Sri Lanka, but also I was ordained in Thailand. But what I will say is, in Sri Lanka here, I know of no other bhikkhu who has these qualities of being able to live in the forest, and by doing so being such a good example for other monks to follow in Bhante's footsteps, and also this incredible learning. We can find many Sri Lankan monks who learn it. Can we find Sri Lankan monks who are so learned in Pali that they can actually give criticism and suggestions to the Pali professors overseas? Yes, we can. But even so, do we find such monks who are so learned living alone in the forest? As I said, you cannot live alone in the forest unless you understand yourself, your own mind. When I first met Bhante Gnanadeepa, he had this love of solitude, so much that he tended to be a little bit dismissive. And this was actually a quality. He liked his seclusion, so he didn't like to have too much association with lay people. Always he had that quality. But even for other bhikkhus, he did not like his solitude to be disturbed. But later, in Lagalu, when other forest monks came, he learned to live with the other members of the Sangha and became very generous with his help to other bhikkhus. What actually happened was, in recent years, several years ago, Bhante was found to have terminal cancer. And so it took its course, and so Bhante died. It's September the 12th, this is 2020. Bhante had no problems finding monks to help to look after him. Monks who'd been to Lagala, experienced living with him, associating with him in Lagala, were only too pleased to have that extra contact. Now Bhante is now sick, he's actually weak, he cannot have his own independence, his own seclusion. So it was just another aspect of the training of forest monks, that we could go and actually attend on Bhante. We could give him whatever support we could. We were so grateful for him. And one of the attendant monks told me, one of the 10 monks who was looking after him for many months, said, although all the pain and difficulties Bhante had over the last 6 months, he never ever once complained. Never once complained. It's normal if you have strong discomfort. And here's someone who's been living alone and independent for almost his whole life, but now he is dependent, with monks helping to look after him. There was no criticism, there was no anger, and that's quite remarkable. If someone is in such intense pain, discomfort, requiring care, and the carers get no criticism, get no anger, get no irritation back, that is quite remarkable. That shows something about Bhante's Gnanadeepa's mind, his ability to live in the forest, to go on Ven.Matara, to meet elephants, to meet sometimes sloth bear occasionally, to have the leopards, confronting an elephant. I know Bhante was charged a number of times by an elephant. One time Bhante was actually trampled by an elephant, so one leg is about 1.5 inches shorter than the other, because the leg got broken at the hip joint, and it was difficult to reset the leg so that the leg was the same length as the other one. But Bhante, when this happened in 1993 in the national park on the north side of Lagala, after Bhante recovered, spent the Vasa in the forest monastery, then he walked back to Lagala. This took days. And I was actually staying in one of the kutis, and Bhante turned up. So after the Vasa. And he was walking 5 miles per day. He couldn't walk more than that, otherwise the hip joint which had been broken would cause too much pain or discomfort. But his one wish was to walk back to Lagala, back to the wilderness, once again to be alone in the forest. So Bhante has faced all kinds of hardships, being trampled by the elephant, spending the whole day and night just lying injured in the forest until help came the next morning. He's been bitten by snakes, he's been... one thing, in Lagala, in Sri Lanka, we have this black ant. We call it locally the kadeo. And the kadeo are in long lines. It's a large black ant, and it's got the most terrible bite. It is true, over a period of time, gradually you can get more used to the bite. But the bite, once you get bitten, it is so strong that you jump. And sometimes you actually let out different, maybe swear words or something like this, or my God or whatever. But when I was following Bhante, he's my senior, I saw him being bitten by this ant on the forest path. I never saw him jump. I jump. I never saw him jump. I just see him stop, lift up his leg and take the biting ant off the foot and just throw it to one side and carry on. I find that remarkable because we're talking about instinct here. The bite comes without warning. It is so strong. And here Bhante can actually have sufficient mindfulness where he does not jump, not like myself, and with awareness just lift up his leg, take the ant off and throw it away. So these are qualities that Bhante has developed through his life. This ability to live in solitude, forest solitude, to be so learned, remarkable, this remarkable learning by memory, and also this ability to take hardship of any kind. So the hardship of his cancer as it developed, the incredible discomfort and pain, without showing any irritation or any ill will or any criticism of his attendant monks. And we see it in such things as the biting ants. We see this kind of really mindful, controlled reaction. It all comes from Bhante knowing his mind, confronting his mind, not being disturbed by his mind, knowing that the mind is something which is impermanent, constructed and empty of self. So that's what I would like to say about Bhante, this remarkable Western monk who, after coming to Sri Lanka, ordained, learned to live in the forest, became a wonderful teacher for other forest monks, and so remarkably learned. And also this ability to be able to live with himself, to confront any kind of physical hardship, and to remain calm and undisturbed. That is quite remarkable, and that's why when Bhante died, we had hundreds of forest monks coming to pay respect to his body. So that's my little introduction to who Bhante Gnanadeepa was. Someone who has been a great inspiration for everyone.
To get updated with valuable Dhamma knowledge, subscribe and share the Samma TV channel today.